So, and now I would like to welcome back to the AA Nasreen Serahi, who is an architect and fully involved in the teaching of architecture as well. Nasreen actually studied and taught at the AA for many years, and then taught at several American universities, Columbia University, Princeton University, and she was head of the architecture school at Cornell University for 5 years. And now currently she's directing the School of Architecture Paris Malaquais in Paris. And also she's head of the Institute of Art and Architecture at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Parallel to all this, Nasreen has her studio, which was founded in 1998 in Paris. And she won an award for the Temporary American Center in Paris, and since then has completed a number of buildings and has taken part in a number of urban design competitions and also in the design of public institutions and residential complexes in different places like Paris, Marseille, Beijing. And in the last 4 years, Nasreen has been acknowledged for the different forms of contribution to architecture by the Minister of Culture in France and also by the French Academy of Architecture. Please welcome Nasreen. And the title of her, I would like also to say the title of her talk, which is Das Bau d'Architecture, Reading Architecture. So from writing to reading.
Thank you, Marina. It's so nice to be back. Even it's home, it's being home. I'm still nervous.
Why?
I don't know.
Shouldn't be.
Because of you. You know, that's the quintessential figure of literature, you know, Virginia Woolf. I discovered her very late, actually, in my adulthood, probably, I should say. And I was just told, are you sure that's what she said? Nothing has really happened until it has been recorded? I'm almost sure that that's what she said. A few years ago, I was supposed to be giving this lecture, finally, in this fantastic sort of position in France at the Cité de l'Architecture, you know, sort of the Cité de l'Architecture has symbolically an incredible moment in your life as an architect in France. And the only way that I could think of my presence within France in the past 25 years of my life was to see how I could actually bring another angle of vision to an institution which is still infested with absolute sort of powers of the Beaux-Arts. So I thought the only way that I could do it was through an English woman called Virginia Woolf. And that was through her fantastic seminal work of, which everybody knows, of course, and everybody has even read it as a textbook in school. What is this thing making some noise under me? It's a Post-it. A room of one's own. So through a room of one's own, I came to the to the conclusion that we were dominated figures in architecture, whether we were women or men, and that through this domination, somehow one had to build up a critical position for oneself in order to be sort of away from this domination somewhere. So if we 1 minute just look at the significance of what it could mean to write things, you know. Writing could be informational. I think Mario very eloquently this morning showed to us the capacity of writing both as information, but also as a warning, but also as an image. And it could also be something that is absolutely, as I said, a piece of warning. Now, the superimposition of writing, which actually makes some kind of an image, becomes very important, especially in the work of architects. I'm not a writer. I don't claim to neither be a writer nor a historian, but I do like good writing, and I do desire very good writing. Now, when about 20 years into my practice, I was asked for the second time to position myself and say something about architecture, I thought that it was very important to say that not through the projects, but through words, and through words that become extremely constructed, and therefore they become writings. Dasibao, and not Dasibaos perhaps, because Dasibao d'architecture in a way, and I don't want it to become sort of the literalness of pain and sort of suffering of the Dasibao, but was a very important way of allowing the public, and not only architects, to begin to be able to communicate, read, and not only understand, but read and put themselves within a very specific position, which I call a critical position in architecture. Now, the reason that we had to describe within the exhibition that we were going to show and the exhibition that we were going to make of our projects, we had to describe what Dasibao was because of the fact that Chinese have a very, very specific relationship to Dasibao. Being, for some Chinese, a very important moment of not only discontent, but critical moment of the cultural history of the Chinese, and that it could mean, for some Chinese, a very painful moment of their lives. We called it Dasibao d'architecture, this exhibition. It was because of the fact that we wanted to somehow describe architecture through a very different communicative mode than what the tools of architecture are. So in fact, we had these sort of, this is the entrance to the exhibition. The invitation, I specifically chose 2 plans or 2 drawings of territory near Beijing, which, and I was showing through the 2 images that master planning could have different visions, not only one. It doesn't have to be one plan. But also, we were showing a very sort of a mysterious image of what architecture could be and what an exhibition of architecture could be. So there were these sort of, let's call them bath curtains, if you like, or let's call them affiches, posters, that we were hanging in an exhibition in order for the public to be able to go through a series of our thinking in 10 years of our production of architecture. So these were the sort of the images that I'm going to show you just to see what the exhibition looked like. Now the exhibition was supposed to be sort of a moving exhibition and going from city to city. However, it was going to be very different how one deals with words in different places. From Paris, it was easy because it was in English, and all the posters were written in English and in French. Rouen, we're still in France. When it went to China, it had a very different meaning for the Chinese, even though everybody was reading both English and French. However, what was interesting was also to see the different ways that these posters were beginning to have a dialogue in the space that they were. Now, they went to China actually, and they never came back, so we can't make it go anywhere else. I had a very, very sort of brief conversation with Brett some time ago, saying that maybe they should come to the front members room, but they can't anymore, so you can just see them here, because they came back from China and they were completely destroyed, because DHL apparently sublets and sort of subcontracts sending stuff from China, and therefore it doesn't go through DHL. So when they arrived back to Paris, they were in pieces. So let's start with this sort of suggestion, yeah? Architects often forget that critical thinking depends on exposure, and that the simplest form of debate must start with a proposition. Das Bau d'Architecture exposes our work as a series of declarations and propositions, open to criticism and debate. We believe that criticism is an essential interface that allows the architect to engage with the greater public. Somewhere in the 70s and the 80s, architecture lost its conviction, its capacity for political activism, and its power. It rose to stardom in the 90s, and when architects became as well known as pop singers, everyone started to desire architecture. Perhaps it is time to stop abusing the power of architecture and allow it to become, once again, a platform for criticality, social awareness, and political engagement. We still believe in the power of architecture to make environments that allow us to inquire, measure, and determine our active position in society. Das Bau d'Architecture proposes a voyage through the most condensed periods of our practice of architecture in the past 10 years. Days of total disappointment, hours of extreme joy, and moments of radical thought, the life of an architect. Now, it was very important to see how we were going to put these things together. So this model basically shows you the space of the gallery in Paris, and how a series of these the thoughts had to somehow come together under some specific themes. I'm not wanting to really put this in any parallel to the way that one deals with chapters in a book, but it's very important. It was very important for us to see what was it that we were going to be saying in terms of each project. So the projects were divided into sections, and the sections such as ground, plane, public realm, urban transformers, geography, time and perception, observing topography, repetition and difference, constructing a site, education of an architect, platforms, city in section, were allowing a series of our projects to fall into these moments that were the thoughts or the thinking that we had on these projects. I'm going to take you through one of them, and then maybe we'll just very quickly go through some others, and just I will describe, or I will try and attempt to show you how and why we had picked out the way that we decided to show these projects. So, the first poster is supposed to be having a family of projects under it. So it's the avant-propos, or it's the first page of the portfolio in a way, yeah? Ground and the building's relationship to it are difficult questions in architecture. The modern movement, and specifically Le Corbusier, saw the ground as a new surface that needed to be liberated. Freeing the ground plane allows the building to hover over a stable surface. Our society of spectacle, obsessed with the monetary value of things, has transformed this idea into a cowardly debate on property ownership. Who does this ground belong to? The moderns took the ground and put it on the roof so that the inhabitants could appropriate it. The toit terrasse, or roof garden, shifted the public domain to a private and controlled leisure space. If we follow Gideon's chronology, which classifies Utzon in the 5th generation of the moderns, Koolhaas belongs to the 6th generation, and we belong to the 7th. In the Sydney Opera House, the ground, even if artificial, finds another status. The podium becomes a singular moment of articulation between geography and architecture, which floats above the constructed ground. In the house in Bordeaux, the ground is dematerialized. and in the Lille Congrès Expo, it is heavily, though artificially, constructed. Architects of my generation who claim to have a thesis on the subject play with its surface, fold it, undulate it, crease it, dissolve it. All these actions seem formally attractive, but are they critically engaging in the debate with the moderns of the past generations? Ground must be programmed in order to be activated. Let's organize the ground according to the geology of its site, its geography, sometimes treating it as a public realm, sometimes as shifting ground, sometimes as a double ground, however, always as programmed ground. So this starts a series of propositions that we bring into some of our projects. So if you look at that, that's one of the posters that you see. And then the reader or the viewer into each part of the sort of drawing or image that there is focuses onto different parts of these posters. So in fact, you have the choice of reading what we're saying about the project, or you have the choice of reading the drawings as another way of reading architecture. Now, in each poster, there is a very, very specific name that we have chosen for the project. The girasole is not only a reference to a moment of history in architecture, not to the names of two very specific projects by very specific architects, but also it in itself entails the idea of the project itself. So all of a sudden, the naming of the project becomes specific into the way that one pronounces the idea of the project. Now, within the text, there's gray text that is written all over the poster, but you can maybe just see them. There's one piece orange, there are some purple, and there's some red. Every time the location of the building or the project is within the text, highlighted through its color, but also the most important readings begin to happen through a series of the highlighted colors that one, through the meandering of the exhibition, finds out the overall ideas. So here we're talking about ground, but we're also talking about two main ideas here. One, as I have put it in red in the text, one is the Respublica of Hannah Arendt, and the other one is the famous table of Le Corbusier. So these two references all of a sudden begin to hold the text together. But also at the end, there's a proposition that comes immediately to the text, and that is the question. The question is, can social housing afford public spaces? And immediately it's answered by saying yes, although only if architecture facilitates it. So in fact, through these, there's not only the description of a series of the projects that we're showing, but there's also propositions based on what has not been possible within the projects, because in fact the projects are mostly competitions that are either being produced as pieces of architecture now, or competitions that have been archived. Yeah. So this is a competition that is now archived. I don't even say dead, because I would like to go back to this idea that Mario was bringing out, and I think most of the room was beginning to go towards, is that we only legitimize architecture if it is built. So in reality, architecture becomes a legitimate act, therefore a construction, if it is built. Through what we were doing here, writing about these things and allowing the readability of these projects to exist, we were ourselves trying to legitimize the act of making these things even though they are not built pieces of architecture. So then there are very specific selections of the drawings which every time talk about, we're still in the section of the ground, we're still talking about how ground can become this other possibility if it is programmed, and therefore the drawings that are shown onto these posters actually become not only the legitimization of these ideas, but also those that began to write the capacity of the idea of ground. So urban transformers, again, becomes another beginning of another idea, which here we're putting together three main ideas. One is that when we talk about renovation or transformation in urbanism today, we deal with almost, if I'm not exaggerating, 65% of what is going to be the commissions of architects in the future, in the very near future. So transformation becomes a very, very important part of architectural construction in the years to come. So that's why we're not working with renovation any longer, but we're trying to bring in the idea of transformation as a way of changing the main idea of the projects in this case. Now, if you look at here, dilapidated infrastructures, the place in Rotterdam, how many more leisure spaces can our societies crave and our cities truly afford? It's a criticism of the fact that most of the programs in urbanism today ask for large amounts of commercial spaces. Commercial spaces all of a sudden began to be criticized through the way that we reprogram these projects. Then I will go further to just zoom on some of these drawings, which are in fact in themselves trying to somehow exaggerate, but also allow for the reading of the text to happen. So the snaking block is basically a project which is about a 19th century sort of in Hoofdbogen in Rotterdam, which is a piece of infrastructure which basically linearly as a snake goes right on from the central station up outside of the city of Rotterdam. And the whole idea here was to show how the idea of the block could be transformed into a linear thing as opposed to a block as we see it normally, as we perceive it normally. The idea of superimposition in urbanism, but superimposition of different, not only programs, but spaces becomes very important again, in these transformative projects. And if you look at it here, what the four main ideas are about. Is it possible to exploit the very nature of a space by a way of reprogramming? When we're suggesting that there is a superimposition of two types of programs into a public space, we're re-questioning the way that one can actually work with public spaces. We propose to superimpose these two programs so that the buses become an integrated part of the public space. Public space in the 21st century can no longer afford to be a space of representation like a Baroque piazza. Shopping cannot be their only pastime, public's pastime. So immediately, this interweaving of a series of problems that we're dealing with began to not only be shown as architectural propositions, but also as written acts. Now, then we go back again to this idea of the avant-propos, or the title pages, if you like, or the beginning of the chapters, which of each set of projects. Now, there are specific questions that we're again asking as a whole, and here, it was very important for me to bring into urbanism the idea of geography and time, because geography and time have been issues that have gone out of the city because of the fact that they have become sectorized within the capacity of geographers to, for instance, work with specific moments within the forming and the shaping of the territories. So I'm just going to read the last part of this. Geographies need to be accentuated, shifted, and replaced. Demographies modified, and education activated at a global scale. The dilemma still lies ahead. Now, as soon as we bring that into something like a project in China, and as soon as that opens up the idea within the places that development is happening on 100 kilometers of 100 square kilometers of areas. We're no longer talking about parts or bits of the city, but we're talking about territories that are being developed. And when we're talking about how you can actually develop a territory without doing anything on it, but with doing very, very little things on it, then it becomes very important very critical almost, to bring into the question, how do you stop development and how do you allow for development to happen? So the question of what is our attitude towards time in the creation of urbanism, how could we plan a territory such as this after all that has occurred in Dubai? What might the lessons of Chongli be if Venturi were to visit it 70 years from now? Become very important questions that we're asking ourselves in order to be able to develop without development. What does that mean? That means that when you are faced with a project which is 105 kilometers squared in China, and that you know that it is, that you're dealing within 4 years in terms of time to develop a project of not only the size, but the territory, but also the development of a 19th century city, such as 19th century city. I mean, of course, Paris is not 19th century only, but I mean, let's call it one of the 19th century cities. And it is the equivalent of this 107 square kilometers of Paris. Then the question of non-development becomes very important in terms of how do you bring in infrastructure before you actually begin to develop these geographies. So these are moments that come into our writing or the way that we describe the projects, is how one looks at a variety of moments that have been inscribed within the history of urbanism and geography, and how there is a very different way of bringing in infrastructure, or the way that Corb would have looked at infrastructure. Now, then we propose that there could be differences when you are actually doing a master plan within time, when time is actually built into this master planning. These then become a series of these questions that are dealing with the problem of urbanism. And I would like to go to maybe just the last two Dazibaos. This one, I will go through its reading. History and geography were two subjects that I would do anything to miss at school in Iran, and then in the United States. They were taught to us as a collection of dates and data. Architecture, however, made me interested in them because I could see them as possible generators of the future. The Google Earth generation apprehends geography in the form of screenshots that are an easily consumable commodity. No need to get on an airplane to see the Earth from the sky anymore. Apollo 11 brought Earth to our television screens. I was 11 years old at the time, and to see a man in a puffy spacesuit walking on the moon was extremely exciting. America was starting to conquer the universe when we only knew the name of Yuri Gagarin. He was our hero. He had seen the Earth from farther away than Le Corbusier, as an object contained in a deep, infinite space, which would become Google Earth some 40 years later. The skin of the Earth needs to be revealed. How? Weren't the Dutch the first to alter topography in order to survive and even colonize? So through this kind of avant-propos, then there are a series of projects again that are put into question, but also brought forward to see how we can begin to slowly scratch this, the surface of Earth. Now, then the texts also go very much into the descriptions, for instance, of the site, because we know that one of the most the difficult things is when you are actually looking at a project and you look at the site and you look at the building on the site, and it becomes primordial, in fact, to say that on one of the most spectacular hills of Lyon, the turn of the century, the Brousse Hospital was extended in the 70s, and then it goes on. So the story begins to situate you. So the writing, in a way, situates what architecture fails to do in the way that it does through either drawings or images. So the idea here begins to weave and superimpose and interlock a series of moments that drawings try to do in architecture, but also architecture does. When we get to the buildings that we're exhibiting that are already finished and already have photographs of themselves and not drawings, and they're not about drawings anymore, then we refuse to show any kind of images of them, even though I hope that by now you have realized that we refused to make any shows of any of the perspectives. So the constructed images of the projects are those only that have the capacity of being constructed through what we call in architecture drawings. Yeah? The only place that you begin to look at the reality is when the building is built. However, that reality we put into question when we actually are showing other projects that we think are very important in terms of their ideas, but we show them only through their drawings. So now, constructing a site is a good one because site planning, which was something that I think all architecture schools have probably given up on site planning, actually, because it doesn't matter where the site is anymore, you know? Which was a book by Kevin Lynch, could come in handy in these days of green design and LEED certification. Architects are bombarded with directives on the best way to design, position, and orient their buildings on a site so as to be environmentally friendly. What an insult. What went wrong? When did architects lose the ability to work with an idea as fundamental as siting? Is it the fault of the moderns again? They taught us how to occupy and construct a site, but sometimes also to ignore it. Nowadays, the public believes that architects don't know how to correctly site a building on a parcel of land without the aid of an Excel spreadsheet. In siting a building, a number of factors are at work: climatic conditions, topography, scale, views, etc. Usually the architect does not choose the site, except perhaps in the case of Frank Gehry and the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. Even if we don't have the choice, architects should still reflect and critique the manner in which they are forced to position their building on the site, even if it costs them to commission. In other words, the site must be designed. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to sort of read this almost, they are almost as declarative as Corb was. However, they have another sort of very odd, perverse tone to them, which is we're saying that not only to us, to architects, but also to the public. So there's a superimposition of, we can call it perversity, or a superimposition of the lessons that we're trying to be learning from ourselves. So I won't go into that, but it's an interesting one in terms of one thing. Every school of architecture that you actually work with, or every school that you design, lycée français in this case, the wall, we called it. Why did we call it the wall? Because you have to protect children from being looked at. You have to protect children from being seen. And now it used to be that, you know, sort of weirdo people would throw things at them. Now it's that there has to be a distinction between the premise whereby one protects children that are going to school. The first thing that they told us when we got to Cairo was that don't forget the fence around the building. So for the Lycée Français, we attempted to create a building along the perimeter of the site that would itself become the wall, creating an interior wall for 1,600 students of the school. This wall is programmed to allow the school to occupy it. In parts, it is the library or classrooms. In others, it is the gymnasium. In the center, it opens up into an esplanade that doubles as a playing field. This wall protects, organizes, educates. Postscript. Competitions are always painful. Crib death is the apt description that Rem Koolhaas applies to projects that die before they come of age. And while it may be necessary to go see the winning entry that actually gets built, it is even more difficult to mourn the crib death of one's own project when its loss has given rise to a monster. Now, let's go to the end, because I want to finish this with the education of an architect. Education of an Architect is a title borrowed from John Haydock, an educator and contemporary of Alvin Boyarsky and Colin Rowe. In the 70s, these three men upheld the standards of debate on architecture, one at the Cooper Union in New York, the other at the Architectural Association in London, the third at Cornell in Ithaca. I was studying at the AA when Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers were building the Pompidou Center in Paris. Rem Koolhaas was completing Delirious New York, and Rowe was putting the final touches on Collage City. Architectural education has always been at the center of my practice, not as a crutch, but as a generator. I do not teach out of a need to transmit or share ideas, nor to have followers. I teach in order to clarify my ideas, and testing them with my students is the best measure of the synthesis and clarity of a thought. The architect needs to be critical, and criticality needs a platform where nothing is at stake except questions. Every architect needs to have a dual practice, one that allows for questioning, the other for implementation. Le Corbusier challenged authority in order to allow for the political to become the condition in which architecture is practiced. 20 years of teaching, what has this taught me? That schools are one of the last bastions of criticality, and one of the few institutions where one can still be political. Recently in America, they told me, are you really sure that we can do that in America? Can we be political in schools in America? I said, well, you're the deans. I don't know, you have to tell me, but we can talk about that later maybe. So, as a homage, as an homage to architects, there I couldn't be really sort of making any other title for this project than having this homage to architects, you know. Designing a school of architecture after 20 years of teaching in several should be an easy task. Yet, designing a building inhabited by architects and students of architecture is a nightmare. It's the feeling of being confronted by hundreds of critics day after day, even after the building has been built. A parody of your worst dreams coming true. The only response to the question posed by the competition brief for the extension to the School of Architecture in Lille was to find a way to comment through architecture on the range of questions confronting our discipline today. What is the role of structure in architecture? Where does structure begin and architecture end, and vice versa? What attitude should we adopt with regard to the question of surface or facade? What position should we take on the question of details when the client's budget hardly allows for the building? How can architecture respond to the specifics of a pedagogical program, and should it? How can the architecture of a school inspire its students during the 5 years they spend there? We are still questioning. We have the answer here. It has to be a house. Pier Luigi Nervi is still alive. Thank you very much.